David and Goliath, the iconic story. The odds seem insurmountable, defeat inevitable, the opposition perfectly terrifying in their sheer relentless power. The people appear too unprepared, too unsteady, too untested. And on top of all that, Nick Saban had never lost a game to a former assistant coach. And the number one ranked Alabama football team had won their last 19 games. Texas A&M, meanwhile, had their starting quarterback get injured early in the season, had lost their first two SEC games. And yet last night, their true freshman quarterback led them out to tie up the game, and then in the final second, a man whose name is small stepped out and kicked a field goal with no time left on the clock, and the mighty Alabama fell 41-38. I know many of you here in DC don't care, but you should. I just had to get that out of the way as an Aggie. David and Goliath, it's such an iconic story that here in the West, we use it to describe any moment where a small team or individual can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. And it's an iconic story for a reason. The writer of this text does in it what is rarely done in the rest of Hebrew scripture. It prolongs the story of a battle. It brings in all these quotes. You are meant to fixate on this story. And yet here's the funny thing. As much as we use it as a metaphor for the little beating the big, often when we do that with sports teams and things like that, we miss the very heart and theme of the story. And I don't want to do that this day. What we saw last week is we saw the identification of the king. And what we'll see in this iconic story today is the introduction of the king. What is he like? And he's going to come in the midst of conflict. And let me tell you two things. Number one, we're going to look at the story together. We'll walk through it. And I promise you, it's not the equipment that will make the difference. And then number two, we'll apply it to our lives. And I promise for many of you, this will not be in the way you expect. But to comment, if you saw in verse 1, you notice it said the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. After King Saul was anointed king, he had to face the Ammonites. And last chapter, David was anointed king, and now this chapter begins, now the Philistines. Leaders are tested, and here comes the first test for David. And the Philistines, if you don't know, were their neighbors to the west. The Philistines lived along the Mediterranean coast. They were a sensual and a warlike culture. Prostitution in their worship and aggressive military expansion were hallmarks of this society. And it's important to notice here, where they camped with their entire army was an area, did you notice, that belonged to Judah. So this is not simply a face-off. This is an invasion. This is them encroaching on a weakened Saul, and life and death is in the balance. And then in verse 2 and 3, we get the lay of the land, that Saul and his men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on one side of the mountain, Israel on the other side, and a valley sat between them. So here you have the Philistines on one mountain, Israel on the other. Israel, back in Genesis, when the whole world rebelled against God and went wrong, God picked out one man, Abraham, and said, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to use your people to be a blessing to the whole world. And God, out of that man, created a tribe, then the nation of Israel. God settled them on a particular piece of land in the center of the nations, and God told them, I am going to bless you so you can be a blessing to the world. And so here they stood to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Their job was to listen to God and then extend out the name of God to the nations. So they should feel confident here. Our God has planted us in this place for a purpose. And yet something's going to happen in verse 4. That out of the camp of the Philistines comes a champion named Goliath of Gath. That word champion, it's kind of a weird word. This is actually the only place it's ever used in Scripture. Literally in Hebrew, it's the combination of the word man and between. That a man steps out between these two armies. He interposes himself before his enemy. And their representative steps out, and he is huge. The text says his height was 6 cubits and a span. That means he was maybe somewhere around 7 feet or possibly even taller than 8 feet. Currently, the tallest living man on the planet, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, is Sultan Kosin, a part-time farmer who stands at 8 feet, 1 inch tall. He had a tumor on his pituitary gland that allowed growth hormone to keep coming out until the University of Virginia performed a surgery on him that made him stop growing. So he stopped short of the tallest man ever recorded, who was an American, Robert Wadlow, who grew to 8 feet, 11 inches tall. Goliath is big. And not only was he physically superior, he was technologically superior. And did you notice there were 3 verses that give you this rundown of all of equipment, his helmet, his coat of mail, his armor, weighing 5,000 shekels. It's 125 pounds. Why all this detail? This is very uncommon in the Hebrew Bible. I don't know if you've read the scriptures. It doesn't give detail like this. You don't read Genesis and it say, as Adam crested the hill, wind swept through his blonde hair. It doesn't say that. Adam, good, tree, bad, ate tree, bad. Like the Bible is Spartan in its language. Why all this material about his wardrobe? Well, the description of his height and his size and his weaponry is meant to draw you into the fear of the Israelite experience. It's a thematic effect. This man is big. He is technologically superior. The tip of his spear weighs 15 pounds. He is intimidating, and it's also designed to test you. Because do you remember what we learned in the last chapter? That size does not matter. That God told Samuel concerning Eliab, don't look at the height of his stature. God said, hey, the size of a man doesn't matter. The purposes of God prevail. You saw in the story of Jonathan, hey, the power of the Philistine forces don't matter. God's purposes can never be thwarted. We've been learning all through this. Their size and their power does not matter. God can win by many or by few. This is a test. Will you apply what we've learned so far in this series? Will you trust God even when your circumstances seem huge? And I think the answer for many is, well, yes, God, when it's Eliab, but look at that guy. He is really big. And scary. And not only does he look scary, he talks scary. And in verse 8, he stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. And Goliath begins to educate Israel on the concept of representative combat. He says, hey, why don't you send out a man between? You send someone to step out between your army and me and let them represent you. There's no reason for all of us to shed blood. Let your man step out there. And if he loses, you all lose. If he's victorious, you all share in his victory. Send out a hero who will stand in for you against me. Give me a champion. And not only does he do that, it says in verse 10, and the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. That word defy shows up all throughout this text. It's a strong word. It means to taunt or to scorn or to disgrace. It was a serious offense in that culture. It was a reproach that he lays on them that only a champion can take away. How will the people of God respond? The people God chose to accomplish his purposes that cannot fail? Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. There's fear. They sound like my football team in high school. I was the center of the offensive line as a freshman, weighing in at 120 pounds, when most linemen are 200. That's the level of ball we were playing. We didn't win much, and I'll never forget one day being in the huddle in the middle of the game. And as we're huddling and the receiver's running in the play, I remember the lineman next to me went, I just want to go home. I was like, what? We're on the field. What is the matter with you? This is so bad for morale. And here's Saul, the man who was known as the one who was head and shoulders taller than all others. The one man who should be leading them in confidence to follow the Lord is cowering in fear. He leads them in being literally shattered with fear because of the obstacles he sees before him. His heart is discouraged and the people follow him in it. Right? So Goliath is imposing and defiant. Israel's terrified and their king is shattered. Who will respond? Verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah. Now why mention that? Ephrathah is not his mom. It's actually the name of his great-great-great-grandma. Why bring her up? Well, it's interesting because she is a great matriarch from his clan. She was married to Caleb, the great warrior, and she raised her, the great leader and founder of Bethlehem. So David, who in the last chapter, all we knew about him was he was a runt. Now suddenly the writer tells us, yet look closer, there is greatness in him. He looks small, but there's something great in this man. And as he steps forward to the battle, we find out that his oldest sons were in the military fighting alongside Saul. David is too young. He's a youth, meaning under 20. And so he would run back and forth from shepherding sheep to delivering messages. And in verse 18, his dad sends him on an errand. It says, take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000, see if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. His dad wants a token to see if they're okay. And it's important here to notice that as David, the anointed king, arrives at the battle, he doesn't come looking like a warrior. He comes looking like a courier. He's on a cheese run. The man is delivering cheese. He's Uber Eats. And in their greatest hour of need, their hero doesn't look impressive. He looks lowly. He looks humble. And yet when he shows up, we don't have time to preach this, but you notice there's a repetition of language. He left his sheep with the keeper. He left his things with the keeper. As he marches towards his destiny, he divests himself of all that held him back. For many of us to approach your destiny, there's things you have to leave behind. And we watch the king release his worldly attachments to step forward to fulfill his destiny. The old things have gone, the new has come. Behold, the hero has arrived at the battle line. And we get the turning point in verse 23. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. If you were filming this, you would go from a wide shot of Goliath to suddenly the camera whipping around and zooming in on David's face as he turns and said, what did that man just say? And he begins to ask around, what is that guy doing? What is he saying? This man is defying God. David had probably never heard someone curse the name of Yahweh before. And so he starts asking the question, what will be done to the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Whenever someone speaks, it's significant. Here's the first words of David. He's putting a theological lens on their problems. Wait a second, look past the height of this guy. This is God's called us on a mission, and this is defiance against God. This isn't right. He's trying to attack and murder our people. Hey, this isn't right. And David starts to ask the questions, how can this happen? And you notice we don't have time to read it all. His brothers begin to mock him. They begin to accuse him of false motives. We find out why Eliab wasn't anointed in the chapter before, because he had a Saul-line heart. He should have been the first one in line worshiping at the feet of the anointed king, his little brother. Instead, he accuses his brother of wicked motives. But does David engage with his haters? It says he said, it was a word, and he turns away. If David would have engaged Eliab, it would have been about his ego. Let me fight with Eliab as he comes after me. But that wouldn't have saved anybody. That's not the real fight. The real fight's Goliath for the sake of the people who are hurting. And David picks the right battle. Don't get caught up in the little ones. And so he walks past Eliab and continues to ask the question, what is going on? And as he asks those questions, it is heard by Saul, who sends for him. And as Saul sends for him, David says to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Don't lose heart. Your servant will go and fight for the Philistine. Don't lose heart. Your servant will fight for you. And I imagine that was a little shocking. The cheese boy. Who is this kid again? Oh, he was here delivering cheese. He was out back going, got some Gouda for you, Bill, okay? Got some sharp cheddar. Can I tempt you? That guy just stepped forward. And Saul says to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You're a youth, and he's been a man of war from his youth. You can't do this. You lack the skills. And I love David's answer. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Not a strong start. You can't fight this man. How can you beat him? Because I've been hanging out with soft and furry animals. It would be like if you ran out of the stands on the sidelines of an NFL game and say, put me in, coach. I'm like, what? Who are you? Why would I send you in? I've been baking muffins all day. Give me the ball. I'm ready. I don't understand how this makes any sense. David realizes he hasn't won the argument, so he continues. When there was a lion or a bear and it took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, I struck him, and I delivered it out of its mouth. If he arose against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. David can stand up to Goliath on the day of the battle because he stood up to lions and bears in the field. He was victorious in the wilderness, so he can be victorious in the city. And notice his heart. When a shepherd was taken away, he didn't count it a loss. Well, still got 99 sheep. I don't know, that's a bear. No, look at the heart of the shepherding king. He will leave the 99 to chase down the one, and he will destroy the one who attempts to take away his sheep. See that? And David realizes they need one more argument, and so he says in verse 37, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David points beyond himself. I have confidence in the presence because of my God's faithfulness in the past. The God who delivered me then will deliver me now. There is no obstacle too big for him. And so Saul says, may your Lord be with you. And Saul tries to armor him up, and David says, I can't wear this. One, because David's probably too short. Two, because he doesn't fight like that. The hero will not look like you would expect a hero to look. So he takes his shepherding staff in his hand, goes down to the brook, and gets 5 of those stones, which are about the size of a tennis ball. And he walks out toward the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near David with a shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. He sees that he doesn't have the marks of battle. And so Goliath commences to win the psychological war. He insults David, looking at his most prominent weapon, a staff. And he says, am I a dog? You came with a stick? And then he curses David by his gods. That word curse there is theologically significant because when God was founding the nation of Israel under Abraham, he said, whoever curses you, he will be cursed. It will rebound on them. So Goliath doesn't realize he's just put himself in trouble. And according to Leviticus 24, blasphemy against God was a capital offense punishable by stoning. Verse 44, the Philistine said to David, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. He says, man, I'm going to leave you for a gruesome death and a desecrated corpse. And then David begins to speak, his first recorded speech. And did you notice the speech is longer than the fight? Because the speech is the point. And David said to the Philistines, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. He wants to make clear, I'm not out here by a mistake. I'm not like, oh, I thought the shepherds were fighting. He's like, no, I understand what's in front of me. This is not naivete. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. It's not me who fails to understand what you have. It's you who fails to understand what I have. I have the Lord of angel armies, the God of the army of Israel, whom you've defied. And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. And look at the reason, that all the earth may know there's a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. 7 times David references the Lord. This is his. And the speech really comes down to this. The Lord will fight because it's the Lord's battle. And the Lord will get glory. That's David's point. Look, I know I'm little, I know you're big. None of that is relevant because this is the Lord's fight. It's his battle, and he will get glory. And the Philistine arose and came near and drew to meet David. David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. David doesn't cower. He purposefully runs to the battle line, and all Goliath's armor favors that hand-to-hand combat. It looks like Goliath's advantage. But verse 49, but David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank deep into that forehead, and he fell on the ground. David looks like he is running straight into hand-to-hand combat, but then like someone who's driving the lane and then pulls back to make a jump shot. David stops short, pulls out a sling and a stone. It's interesting, the first time I ever studied this passage, I was at a friend's house, and he had a show on in the background called Deadliest Warrior that just analyzed weaponry of ancient civilizations. And I remember as I was studying this passage, literally, I heard the commentator from the TV say, the sling and the stone. And the guy started to talk about how a stone would come out of these slings at over 100 miles an hour. That Goliath literally never saw it coming. And then they practiced it in a lab on the show as I watched. They set up a little human head, and that head exploded when that stone hit it. It was gruesome, right? But the fascinating thing about it is all Goliath was looking at was the stick. Never saw the sling, never saw the stone. So David didn't just win in spite of being small. He won because he was small. David didn't win in spite of his weakness, but because of his weakness. Goliath never saw it coming. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and he killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David, but David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. The very implement meant to destroy the representative of God's people is flipped and used against their adversary. And when the men of Israel saw that, they rose up with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. They ran the Philistines out of their towns and distributed their plunder. Now, in our remaining time, how do we apply this to us? What does this mean? Well, when I grew up, you would typically do this. You would say Goliath equals your fears or your problems, and David equals you. And then the rest of the sermon was, therefore, you need to get out there and kill your problems. It was a pump-up speech, typically delivered at camp, usually on the last night after a week of malnutritious food and a little bit of sleep left us in an emotionally volatile state. Some guy would get up on stage and he would just begin to enumerate them. Goliath is your eating disorder. You got to get out there and kill that eating disorder. Goliath is your lust problem. You got to get out there and kill that lust problem. Goliath is your fear of evangelism. You got to get out there and kill that evangelism or the fear of the evangelism. We're like, right, yes. Right, and on we would go. It was a pump-up speech, and then the band would come back out, and in my era, they would start playing the song, Will you be the one to answer to his call? Will you stand while those about you fall? And then there was a big crescendo key change. You would switch the pronouns. Yes, I'll be the one to answer to his call. I will stand while those about me fall. It's a little condescending to your friends, but the idea was, I will do it. I shall overcome. And it usually worked at camp because, as Tim Keller pointed out, which I love, at camp, you're not scared of anything, right? You're just sitting there around all your friends. You just feel really pumped up. And so it feels good. But then you go home, and there your friends mock your allegiance to your God. There your temptations continually assault you. There your problems come, and they're not easily fixed. And suddenly the fear begins to creep in, and all the discouragement and all the weight and all the anxiety begins to mount and becomes a massive force in front of you, and you start to feel smaller and smaller and dismayed and greatly afraid. And if we're honest, for many of us, our besetting sins today, your anxieties, your fears, your discouragements, your doubts, your lust, that thing you swore you'd never do again that you did again. It all begins to mount up against you, and you are shattered before the might of your enemy. For many of us, a pump-up speech doesn't really work, because when our real fears come at us, we're like Israel. We'll come into this room and shout the war cry, but as soon as it assaults us, we shrink back in fear. And that's really the point of it. We're not like David, if we're honest. We're like Israel. We're powerless. We're helpless. Whatever your besetting sin is, for many of us, there may be 100 enemies you can conquer, but we all have some that get inside on us and we can't win. And let me tell you something. Into the midst of your depravity and helplessness, God does not send a pump-up speech. He doesn't send David to go, oh, come on, guys, because we know Israel's number one. Like, he doesn't do that. David's not there to get them to believe in themselves. If we work together and use all of our skills, God doesn't send a cheerleader. God sends a substitute. God sends a man between that says, I will step out for you. I will fight for you. I will do what you cannot do, and my victory will count for you. And what you and I need is not a pump-up speech in a room like this. What we need is a hero who will fight for us. Because here's the reality. Your big fear, whatever it is not Goliath. It's a Philistine. Now, granted, it's a scary Philistine that is technologically superior to you. But all of our fears, whatever they are, they're little Philistines. They're the little cousins and nephews and brothers of the big enemy, death. That if you think about whatever your greatest fears are, they're just the little brothers of death. Some of you are so afraid of social rejection that you came to DC and you're like, I want to make a difference for Jesus, this little light of mine. You went to your office, you're like, I'm going to tuck it away, all right? And you just realize nobody cares here, everyone's mean, I'm scared, and you're just hiding more of what you love, what you care about, your personality, you've shrunk. Right? Others of us, we want to worship in places like this, and we pray to God. People don't ask us the second and third questions because we're just hanging on because there's some things that are tearing us apart inside. And the reality is, what's your big social fear? What is that? I'm scared of being rejected. It's social death. I'm afraid that I'll socially die, that people won't call me. What is this fear of people finding out your real struggles? It's a reputation death. I'm afraid my reputation will die. So many of our biggest fears, they're little deaths, the little brothers and sisters of the big death. Because death takes everything from you. Death takes it all your hopes, all your dreams, all your friendships, all your talents, all your loves. Death takes all and gives nothing back. And we are powerless before the face of death. And so we don't need a pump-up speech to act like David. We need a David. We need a hero. And this is the point of this passage. Into our helplessness, God sent another boy from Bethlehem. He comes from an obscure town, but there's greatness in him if you're looking close. He arrives lowly. He doesn't look like you would expect. Although he existed in the very form of God, he emptied himself and took the form of a servant. He arrived on our shores as a servant. His brothers mocked him and accused him of bad intentions. His claim seemed silly. You're a carpenter from Nazareth, and you're saying you're the Messiah, the King of Kings? But he stepped out against our enemy. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he said, the God of this world is now judged. And he looked weak. Did he launch an offensive against the devil in Jerusalem? No. He led himself to be arrested and to be beaten and to be shamed and to be mocked and to be crucified. He wasn't wearing armor. He looked small. But he won. Not in spite of his weakness, but because of it. That Hebrews 2 says, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. That Jesus stepped out as our man between, as the substitute. And as he stepped out, he took on what looked like weakness. You have a weak and frail humanity, I will put on a weak and frail humanity. Death is knocking at your door, I will take on death. I will come in small and look like I've been mowed over, but my weakness is actually a strength. Because I will take the very sword the enemy used to kill you, and I will use it to cut off his head. The death that was coming for you, I will use as a doorway into victory for you if you trust me. And what I accomplish in that day will be imputed to all those who trust me. My victory counts for you. That's the gospel. That's our message. That's Christianity. It's not clean yourself up, try to get it figured out, and maybe God will accept you. It's admit you don't have it together. Admit that you need help, and then fix your eyes on the King. And let me tell you where this lands practically for so many of you. You are dealing with some real struggles and real difficulties and real challenges. And you say, I don't know how to stand up against them. But as Hebrews goes on to say, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders, the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and is now sat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, that you won't grow weary and lose heart. How do we not join Saul in losing heart? It's not with a pump-up speech. You fix your eyes on him, the one who ascended into the valley of the shadow of death alone, taking on your and my broken and frail humanity. The one who faced death and let its engine roll over him, and yet rose victorious on the other side and caused the death of death and the death of Christ. You see him emerge victorious on the other side of that battlefield, and you fix your eyes on your king. He seems small, and he overcome my greatest enemy. I have a hope and I have a future that no discouragement, no sin, no addiction, no tragedy can ever take away. I have a future that cannot be stopped by any difficulty in my life. When you fix your eyes on your king that broke through the ultimate nightmare, then you can face any of the nightmares in your life. If he beat Goliath, then I do have a future. And I have a hope, and I have the capacity to drive this Philistine out of my heart. So yes, you have the power to drive the Philistine of lust out of your heart. You don't have to be bound by the conventions of this day. You have the power to drive the Philistine of that addiction out of your life, not because of your power, because you've seen I already follow a victorious king. You have the power to live victoriously, not because you're so great, but because your king is so great. And the greatest fighters are those who know they've been fought for. I read a book years ago about the Spartans. And it was asking the question, why were they so triumphant in battle? Why were they so victorious? Why were they so powerful? And what this book posits, which is a historical fiction, which honestly I think is less Spartan and more Christian, the guy says the reason they fought so bravely was because their king didn't stand in the back conducting their battle. Their king went first. And when they watched their king run into the battle and fight for them, they lost their fear and they ran out to fight alongside of him. And in this book, all through it, they're tracing what makes you so fearless, what makes you so courageous. And finally, on the eve of their final battle, one of these battle-hardened, tough-looking soldiers says, do you know what makes us so courageous? Love. Love. Knowing we're loved and loving him makes us willing to face any tragedy. And that's true. You look at kids today, kids who come from loving homes, who watched somebody not give up on them, are less likely to give up on themselves. It's the one who's seen adults walk away and give up on them that are most likely to give up on themselves. And if you've come from a broken home, you're not too far gone. Don't be discouraged, because here's the good news here. You have a king who fought for you. You have a God who saw all the relentless enemy of this world come at you, and he sent a hero. The humble King Jesus, who looked small and was victorious, fought for you and loves you. And when you fix your eyes on him, you can be victorious. No tragedy in your life need to dictate your story. You have a hero. You have a king. We have the true David, the son of David, Jesus Christ. He's what we're selling. He is our hope. You put your faith in him, and I promise you, he will change you from the inside out, and you will become a great fighter because you know what it is to be fought for. And you watch how God will strengthen you as you wake up every day. God, it's too big for me. God, it's too hard for me, but I fix my eyes on Jesus, and I can endure because I will not lose heart, because I've seen you go through the valley and emerge on the other side. I know I will too. My enemy doesn't determine my story. My king does. That's the hope today. That's the hope for you. That's the hope for me. That's the hope for our church. That's the hope for DC. That's the hope of the world.